Hello, Julie here and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today I'm sharing 3 vintage styled Christmas cards. I'm getting close to the end of my Christmas cards. I think I've only got 3 more to make, so that's one more video. So this is my second to last Christmas card video for this year. I've also added a little bit of decoration to the insides of my cards with this set. Not something that I generally do, but I thought I'd do that this time. I've cut 3 card bases. I'm making 5-inch square cards, so I've cut 10 by 5 and I've scored at 5 inches and I'm now folding those in half. I'm using my Teflon bone folder for that. The card I used is a Coordinations Vanilla Cream. So going with the vintage theme, I think the cream card is a little more vintage than the white. The pattern paper I'm using for all of these cards is the Bo Bunny Father Christmas collection. Now I just noticed that it says 2011, so this is a pretty old collection. So we'll start with this card. I've chosen 2 pattern papers from the pack, and the first one, the stripe, I'm going to cut that 4 3/4 inches square, and the creamy sort of one, I'm going to cut that 4 1/2 inches square. The piece of red will be 2 inches by 4 inches, and I'll also cut a piece of cream cardstock that is 1 1/2 inches by 4 inches. That's the same cream cardstock that I made the card bases out of. Now, because I'm making vintage Christmas cards, I'm going to use my Prima distressing tool to distress the edges of all of the pattern papers. Once I've used my tool to do that, I'm going to use a black ink cube to ink the edges, which gives it that bit more of a vintage feel to it. I think that this particular tool is discontinued now, but I'll put a link in the description box below to similar tools that will do the same thing. You can, of course, also use the edge of your scissors to do the same job. Once I had all my papers prepared, I used double-sided tape to attach them to the card front. I mentioned in a previous video that I'd been to visit my mum and she'd given me some lace and braids and things, so I'm going to use some of the things that she gave me to decorate this card. This lace, I've cut that to 4 inches, and I'm going to put that behind that piece of red cardstock that I cut before. I've also added some chipboard to the back of that cardstock piece, so that when I do attach the panel to the card, it's going to be slightly risen and give that lace a bit more interest. Because of the texture of the lace, I'm going to use my liquid glue to attach that panel to the card front. Then I'm going to attach that cream piece of cardstock on top of that red panel. This is going to help my embellishments to stand out. To embellish the card, I'm going to use these 3 poinsettias. They also came from my mum. So this card is probably going to be the card I will give to her for Christmas. The sentiment for this card was stamped using Kaisercraft's Christmas Edition stamp set and the Versafine Onyx black ink. Then I used a die from, I bought it off of the internet, a lady here in Australia that sells a lot of dies through the marketplace, and it's a sort of lacy rectangle. I cut the greeting out using that and then attached it to a piece of chipboard and attached it to the front of my card. As I mentioned earlier, I'm going to do a bit of decorating on the inside of my cards. So I've cut a piece of the red pattern paper 1 1/4 inches by 4 1/2 inches, a piece of green 3/4 of an inch by 4 1/2 inches, and I've treated the edges of that with my distress tool and my ink cube, and I'm going to just attach that to the inside of the card, sort of to the left hand side of the inside back. I'm also going to use another stamp, a Kaisercraft Christmas Greetings stamp set, to stamp and heat emboss. So I stamped using the Versafine Onyx black ink once again, and then I use clear embossing powder and my heat tool to heat emboss that greeting. So now on to card number 2. I'm going to cut a piece of pattern paper that's 4 3/4 inches square. I'm using the same paper that I used on the background of the first card, the stripe. Then I'm going to cut some cream cardstock. I'm going to layer the pattern papers and cream cardstock all the way up through this front of this card. So I'm going to have pattern paper 4 3/4 inch, cream cardstock 4 1/2 inches, then the second pattern paper is 4 1/4 inches, then the next layer of cardstock is a piece of cream cardstock that's 3 1/4 inches, and then I'm going to use a cut apart from the paper range that is 3 inches square to go on top of that. If you're interested in the measurements and more detail, you'll find them on my blog. I do a blog post for every video that I make, and that includes all of the measurements and photos and stills that you can have a good look at and see exactly how they're put together. I'll put a link to that blog post in the description box below if you want to check that out. Once I have all my layers cut to size, I'm going to distress the edges of each of them exactly the same as I did for the first card. I then went ahead and used double-sided tape to attach the bottom 3 layers to the card front. I also attached a piece of chipboard scrap to the back of the small cream cardstock. Before I attached the pattern paper on top of that smallest cream cardstock square, I added a piece of this tulle. Now, I think that this tulle came wrapped around a bunch of flowers from memory. So I'm just cutting it. It's about 4 inches square, about the same size as the red pattern paper behind it. I can tell you it's not perfectly square either. I'm hopeless with scissors. You wouldn't think that I would make clothing either, would you? But with the way I can cut fabric. But anyway, I cut that piece of tulle and I stuck that between the cream square and the cut apart that's going on top. I use liquid glue to attach my cut apart to my piece of cardstock, and then I've put something heavy on top with an acrylic block to let that dry and make sure that it stays in place. To decorate the inside of the card, I've got this stamp that came free with a card making magazine, and I'm going to use one of the Christmas trees from there. I'm going to stamp that with my Versafine Onyx black ink and then heat emboss it with clear embossing powder. Now, when I stamped this the first time, it did not stamp completely, so I tried to stamp on top of the image that was already there, and of course I didn't get it correctly on place, so I ended up with a double image. But I wasn't too worried about that. It still looks fine, and even after stamping it twice, it wasn't complete, so I used my fine black pen to just draw in the pieces that weren't there. You cannot notice it. My little panel for the front is now dry enough, so I'm going to use my art glitter glue and attach that to the front of the card. I wanted to put Merry Christmas inside, so I've got this pack of Uniquely Creative's Holly Jolly Christmas paper. It's a 6-inch pack, and in there was a cut apart sheet, and one of the cut aparts was a red Merry Christmas. So I've cut that out, and I'm going to attach that to a piece of the striped pattern paper that's approximately 2 1/2 inches square, and then I'm going to attach that to the inside top right of my card. For a final little touch, I'm going to add some Nuvo crystal drops in autumn red as decorations on that Christmas tree. They do have a little bit of texture to them, but not enough to make the card pop open, so yes, I like the look of that. So there we have card number 2 for today. For my last card for this series, I wanted to make a card that had some gold on it. So to start with, I used a stencil. I don't know what brand this stencil is. It came from Spotlight, I think, in a little set, and some of my Deco foil transfer gel. This is the duo one, so this works with hot foil or non-heated foil. And I put the Deco foil gel through the stencil onto a piece of patterned paper from the same pattern paper range. So once I've finished applying this gel, I set it aside to dry. It takes about, well, I let it go for about 24 hours, but I washed my stencil and my palette knife as soon as I had finished. Once it was dry, I laid a piece of foil over the top and then ran over it with my brayer. This gives an even pressure. You can go over any part that isn't quite covered as many times as you like. Just apply the foil and then give it a rub and it will stick to any glue that's not already covered. Once I was happy with the foil, I trimmed that piece of pattern paper down so that it was 3 1/8 inches by 3 3/8 inches. I cut a piece of gold mirror card that was 3 1/2 inches by 3 5/8 inches to go behind that panel. Off camera, I also cut the other layers for the front of my card. I cut a piece of pattern paper 4 3/4 of an inch square, a piece of the gold mirror card 4 1/2 inches square, and another pattern paper that was 4 1/4 inches square. I went ahead and distressed the edges of these papers as well, just the same as I did for the first two cards. I used double-sided tape to attach these layers to the front of my card next. Before I added that smallest piece of gold, I added a piece of scrap chipboard behind that so that my Christmas tree panel would stand up from the front of the card a little. The inside of this card is fairly simple. I cut a piece of pattern paper 4 1/2 inches square. I inked around the edge of it and attached it to the inside of the card using double-sided tape. And then I used a stamp that came free with a magazine, Australian Papercraft Essentials magazine, and I stamped and heat embossed a greeting in there that says, "Wishing you a magical Christmas." And I did that the same way I'd done my previous heat embossing, so I stamp it with my Versafine Onyx black ink and then heat emboss it with the clear embossing powder and my heat gun. So here we have a quick run through of the cards for today, both the outside and the insides. I hope you've enjoyed watching my video today. Don't forget, if you want more details, pop over to my blog and there will be measurements and photos over there that you can check out. Also, if you're not a subscriber already, I'd love it if you would click that subscribe button, and if you click the bell next to the subscribe button, you'll be notified each time I upload a new video. So once again, I've got one more set of 3 Christmas cards to make for this year, so I hope you can join me for that video. Thank you for being here with me today, and see you soon.